So what about the broader picture? Well, I spoke to a man earlier today who should know. His name is Ricardo Alarcón. He's a very close friend of Fidel Castro. He's been involved in the running of this country, intimately involved for the last 60 years or so, 50 years since the revolution. He is currently the President of the National Assembly, and one of his particular issues that he cares deeply about is the issue that we spoke about last night on this program of the Cuban Five. So I asked him why the case of the Cuban Five resonates so strongly with ordinary Cubans.
Terrorism against our people is a very important issue for us. That has meant people losing their lives, people being maimed, being threatened for a long period of time, half a century almost. And the fact that the five continue to be incarcerated and the U.S. authorities continue to refuse to recognize the right of our people to live in peace and security is a fundamental issue for everybody.
When you talk to ordinary Cubans, they will tell us, ever so quietly, that they are very frustrated by the pace of change that was promised to them by Raúl Castro when he became president 2 years ago. What do you say to that?
I think Raúl and everybody else is frustrated with the nature of the problems we are facing and the need to do a number of changes, but at the same time, in the only way you can do them, which is necessarily implies studying, reflecting, acting very, very carefully and seriously in order not to fail.
You represent the generation of the people who began the revolution and have been running this country ever since. Do you think that your generation can actually bring about real change in this country, or should you just all retire?
The majority of my members of my parliament were born after the revolution victory. They are in their 40s. So we are a tiny fraction of thousands of people with responsibilities around the country, the vast majority of them who belongs to the other two generations that have come up after.
A friend of mine here described it like this. He said, Cuba is like a ship heading towards a glorious sunset, held back by an anchor called Castro.
No, the reality is that these people have moved forward for a number of years, essentially led by a man named Castro. That's the reality. Nobody has introduced more changes, real changes, not rhetorical changes, than Fidel Castro. And President Raúl Castro is continuing with the same spirit.
So would you say that Cuba is a democratic paradise? Is that what we're dealing with?
No, paradise was added by you. It's a democracy. And democracy is a constant effort to seek people's empowerment. Critics of the government you can find, and sure, you are aware of a number of them, and they can express their views. As a matter of fact, they do constantly. I am accustomed to listen among many magazines or papers, intellectual groups, and so on. And so what? The difference is when you act on behalf of, paid by, directed by a foreign power, a very common crime in every every parliament in the world has passed legislations condemning that.
Got to leave it there. Mr. Alarcón, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, since the revolution, Miami in Florida has been the home away from home for Cuban exiles, tens of thousands of them. It is there that the opposition against the Castro regime here has been concentrated. It is a place and a community that has had a huge influence on American foreign policy and indeed on American domestic elections. But are things changing Is there now a younger generation of Cuban Americans less interested in settling the scores of the past and more interested in looking towards normalization and the future? Seems to be that there are. Our correspondent in Miami, Andy Gallagher, has this report.
Little Havana, a slice of Cuba so large and well established that it's become known as the island's second city. The first generation arrived here soon after the revolution and quickly established itself as a powerful political force, unified in its opposition of the Castro government. Over the years, their influence has helped shape US policy, and their views have dominated the Miami press.
But today, this is a very different community. Every month, thousands of new arrivals are coming in from Cuba, and there are thousands more born here in the States. And these groups have very different views about US policy towards Cuba. And those changes, seismic in some cases, are now being reflected in the local media here.
Consider the Miami Herald, published in both English and Spanish, and a long-time news source for the exiled community here.
I think there was a time that the Miami Herald kind of was afraid of itself and afraid of the community that it covered insofar as the types of stories that they would write about Cuba.
Frances Robles is the paper's first non-Cuban to cover events on the island. It's a job that comes with its own unique set of challenges.
I have a very high-profile job that nobody wants. You know, everybody always says, oh, you don't want to cover Cuba for the Miami Herald. Don't do it. You know, they don't let you write your stories. You know, they're going to edit it and make it sound a different way. It's going to be a different story than the one that you wrote. So I went in, you know, a little nervous. I'm going to be honest.
But now once dominant views are being challenged, and the way Cuba is covered by the paper has changed.
The conservative community that's used to being the only voice that's heard is, I think, a little taken aback. They're like, what do you mean you're going to run this story about a poll that shows that Cubans are against the embargo, or a poll that shows that Cubans want to travel? You know, that can't be true, or they're not voters anyway, and, you know, and they'll find all kinds of ways of delegitimizing the news.
The evolving dynamics of Miami's Cuban community are something that America TV are all too aware of. The station's name translates as America is watching, and more than half their audience is Cuban American. 25-year veteran talk show host and journalist Maria Laria is one of those navigating her way through change. She says new arrivals from Cuba have very different priorities. Her audience is no longer so straightforward.
A big part of my demographic here is the old exiles. So you have to give them what they want, and what they want is Cuba, and they want to know every little detail of what goes on with Fidel. The new generation does not want to know. They say, that's why I left Cuba. I don't want to know anything about Fidel, and I left, and I don't want to talk about politics, and that's my past. This is my present.
Take a look around the newsroom here. This man was one of Fidel Castro's political prisoners. His colleague across the room, an ambassador under the same government. And then there's a new generation of Cuban-American journalists with their own experiences. It's a reflection of modern-day Miami.
This business of journalism has to change every day. I have to keep in pace with everything new. Now it's very important to have a presence in internet or in Twitter or something like that, that you don't even have an idea that exists in Cuba.
Miami's media coverage of Cuba is all about change, driven in part by the needs of its audience and a new political landscape both in Washington and Havana.
That's news with Cuban coffee.
Andy Gallagher, BBC News, Miami.
Well, let's talk to the resident correspondent who spearheads our coverage here from Havana, our man in Havana, Michael Voss. Great to see you again, Michael. There are those who say that if the United States were to lift the trade embargo against Cuba, that would be the most dramatic way of bringing about democracy or greater reform in this country. Are they right?
Well, certainly the Cubans have been able to use the embargo to cover up their own inefficiencies economically, and also to create a sense that this is an island under a state of siege, and therefore it's an excuse to crack down on dissidents and keep the repression going. The joke amongst, say, Western European diplomats here is that if you really wanted to destabilize this government, you drop the embargo overnight.
I mean, one of the things that struck me is that certainly at the end of the Soviet era, they were taking bets in the State Department in Washington that this place would collapse, that the Castro regime would collapse. At the end of Fidel Castro's era, they were taking similar bets. They've been proven wrong over and over again. Do they have a magic potion here for staying in power?
I think part of it is this is the generation that made the revolution, and that wasn't true of Russia then or of China. And I think that's part of the reason. This is a very nationalistic island. It's been partly about communism and socialism, and it's been partly about independence. And I think having an external enemy has also helped to keep them in power. I mean, I think that at the moment, once the generation that made the revolution go, then it's going to be much more difficult to keep everything together unless they can show that the economy is working, that the system works, and at the moment the economy is in deep trouble.
And briefly, Michael, are you saying that there is a possibility that there will be a smooth transition, an orderly transition to something in the future, we don't know quite what, without any Castros?
It is possible, but really no one's quite sure how this would work. They have to show that this system works, but at the same time there is a lot of pent-up feeling here for change. And once that generation goes, it's very difficult to see who will be the leaders and will they be able to command that same sort of authority.
Michael Watts, thanks for all your coverage. And coming up here on BBC World News America from Havana, Cuba. Welcome back to this special edition of BBC World News America, reporting live from Havana, Cuba. Now, I'm in a place called the Plaza San Francisco in the heart of Old Havana. Just over there, about 200 yards from here, is the port of Havana. That was the main transshipment port for Spanish galleons carrying gold and silver from the New World to the Old World in the 17th century, when that church behind me was built. And the great thing about Cuba is that it's become a sort of melting pot of different cultural layers. There's the Afro-Caribbean layer of culture, there's the Spanish colonial culture, then of course there's the Soviet-inspired communist culture, which has been here since the revolution. It has produced an extremely beguiling mix, and especially in recent decades, an enormous source of national pride as well as talent, as I found out for myself. It's an irresistible sound, salsa seeping out of a cafe, echoing through the nocturnal gloom of Havana. The locals love it, the tourists can't get enough of it. This is the face of Cuban culture much of the world has come to cherish and expect. But did you know that Cuba is also producing a whole generation of Billy Elliots? This is the Havana Ballet School, and the playground is full of boys doing what boys don't usually do in playgrounds. Ballet and revolution aren't usually words mentioned in the same sentence, but Castro encouraged it, and today boys and girls see ballet as a way of pirouetting out of poverty. This is Cynthia. She's 14 years old, and if the record here is anything to go by, chances are that you will see her dance at Covent Garden one day, even though the academy is too poor to repair the latest hurricane damage. Their angelic faces hide hours of hard work in a school that costs nothing, but demands everything. Personally, Cynthia said, it's very important for me to prove that we Cubans have a special talent for ballet. Her idol is Havana's prima ballerina, Beyonce Valdez. So guess who we found down the road in a hidden courtyard?
Come on.
You're her role model, you know.
No.
No, she did. Absolutely. She said that.
Oh, wow. That's cute.
Want to know why she's been the prima ballerina here for almost a decade? Watch this. Beyonce tours outside Cuba at least 10 times a year, earning a fortune, but always returning home. Do you dance for yourself? Do you dance for Cuba? Do you dance for your ballet company?
Well, it is a really privilege and also a big responsibility, because I represent my country. In every place, in every theater, every stage, I dance. It's a kind of my identity. In every place I dance is what I can do for my country.
Is that really important?
It's really important. You know, all the Cubans have this inside.
There are so many aspects of Cuban culture that are surprising, but perhaps the most surprising of them all can be found inside this former palace.